Calendar number 359, SJ Res 61, joint resolution providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5, United States Code, and so forth.
Senator from Vermont.
Madam President, it's been more than 6 months since Hamas's horrific attack on October 7th that killed 1,200 innocent Israelis and led to the capture of 240 hostages. Around 130 people are still being held hostage, and an estimated 100 are alive and remain in captivity in absolutely horrific conditions. The cruelty that has been and continues to be inflicted on them is horrendous, and obtaining their freedom becomes a more urgent priority every day. But in the past 6 months, Israel's indiscriminate bombing has obliterated most of Gaza's infrastructure. Nothing has been spared. And more than 33,000 Palestinians have been killed, and other 7,000 are believed to be buried beneath the rubble. And among the dead are hundreds of aid workers and health workers. Nearly 2 million people have been displaced. Aid trucks are lined up for miles in Egypt waiting to get into Gaza, while the bombs and shells keep exploding. The magnitude of this calamity is staggering. Now, 6 months into this war, Prime Minister Netanyahu has announced that a date has been set for an invasion of Rafah. Rafah today is jammed with an estimated 1 million desperate, destitute Palestinians who were ordered by the Israeli military to leave their homes in the north, homes that have since been demolished, and who are now sheltering under plastic with the few possessions they could carry and not nearly enough food. And last week, less than a month after Jose Andres briefed me and other senators on the daunting challenges his remarkable organization, the World Central Kitchen, faces in getting food to desperate families in Gaza, Israeli missiles destroyed 3 of their vehicles and killed 7 of their aid workers. The descriptions and coordinates of the World Central Kitchen vehicles that were targeted and had been shared with the Israeli military. There was nothing about those vehicles or the people in them that could reasonably have been confused with Hamas. The vehicles were far apart. They were labeled as World Central Kitchen vehicles. Each was targeted and destroyed separately. The deadly attacks on aid and health workers in Gaza has become shockingly common. World Central Kitchen and other humanitarian organizations, which so many people depended on, have had to suspend operations in Gaza. This incident and the killings of other aid and health workers must be thoroughly and independently investigated. Calling it a mistake begs the question. We need to know what happened and why. This outrageous attack on aid workers and Prime Minister Netanyahu's plans to invade the very place his government told Palestinians to go is the latest evidence that the way the Netanyahu government is conducting this war is terribly wrong. It's yet another tragic reason why a ceasefire is immediately needed. Madam President, our priority must be to secure a ceasefire, to free the hostages and get adequate food, water, and medical care to the Gazan population before more innocent people die needlessly. This was affirmed unanimously in the resolution recently adopted by the UN Security Council. But rather than acknowledge Israel's responsibility to implement that resolution and secure a ceasefire, Prime Minister Netanyahu criticized the United States for allowing it to pass. He said the U.S. abstention harms both the war effort and the effort to release hostages. Madam President, I could not disagree more. After 6 months of relentless bombing, the war in Gaza has been a disaster. It has been a disaster not only for the Palestinian people, but for Israel, for the United States, for the hostages, and for the cause of peace and security in the Middle East. Last week, families of the hostages were among the tens of thousands of Israeli protesters calling for Netanyahu to resign. Madam President, we need to ask ourselves, what could possibly need to happen before the United States finally stops financing a war strategy that has so disproportionately killed civilians, used food as a weapon, made Gaza unlivable, and that has no realistic vision of a peaceful future for either Palestinians or Israelis? I believe that the time has already come. Israel does not need more bombs for Gaza. The United States should stop paying for this. What Mr. Netanyahu consistently fails to acknowledge that the American people are paying for this war, a war that most Americans do not support. It is their tax dollars that have purchased the bombs, tanks, artillery shells, machine guns, and ammunition that have been used by Israel in what has become a war not just against Hamas, but a war against the Palestinian people. Overwhelmingly, Vermonters who have contacted me, like a substantial majority of the American people, are absolutely horrified about what is happening in Gaza. In all the years he has served as prime minister, Mr. Netanyahu has never articulated a vision for an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. To the contrary, he's been on a mission, which he has confirmed publicly, to destroy any possibility of a future Palestinian state while preserving Israel as a Jewish state. Those goals are fundamentally incompatible if Israel is to remain a democracy, and we support the Jewish democratic state of Israel. Yet on March 22nd, the Netanyahu government announced the largest seizure of land in the West Bank since 1993. Madam President, nothing can excuse the brutality of Hamas. We all know that, which for years has squandered precious resources that could have been used to improve the impoverished lives of the people of Gaza. But just as Hamas's atrocities and the Iranians and others who aid and abet them should be absolutely universally condemned, so must we recognize that there is a long history to this conflict. For years, the United States, Republican and Democratic administrations, and this Congress has unconditionally supported increasingly extreme right-wing governments led by Mr. Netanyahu, even though he has consistently acted in ways that are directly contrary to our policies, our principles, and our national interest. In the West Bank, in the past 3 years alone, Israeli land seizures, settlement construction, demolitions of homes, and violence against Palestinians have soared in flagrant violation of international law. But rather than hold the Netanyahu government accountable, U.S. government officials keep repeating the same tired refrain that such actions, quote, are an obstacle to peace, and nothing changed. And despite evidence of human rights violations by Israeli soldiers, the Leahy Law has never been applied to Israel, not by this administration or any of its predecessors. And meanwhile, Congress has continued to approve billions of dollars unconditionally for the Netanyahu government. Madam President, I've spoken many times about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Month after month, as Gaza was being destroyed, I and others have called for greater access for aid trucks and the protection of civilians and aid workers. I've called for an indefinite ceasefire. President Biden has called for a ceasefire. Vice President Harris has called for a ceasefire, and so has the UN Security Council. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has ignored it all. The humanitarian crisis has grown steadily worse, and the war is far from being won. Netanyahu's strategy in Gaza is reminiscent of that famous quote of an unnamed U.S. major in Vietnam who said it became necessary to destroy the village in order to save it. That's what's happening to Gaza. It won't work here as it didn't work there. Nobody disputes Israel's right to go after the perpetrators of the October 7th massacre. But that atrocity and that security failure did not provide license for Israel to go to war against an entire population, killing tens of thousands of defenseless people, targeting aid workers, preventing life-saving aid from getting to the victims, all while the hostages remain trapped underground, not knowing if they will survive another day. This is not the Israel the American people have supported and defended, with my support, with $300 billion since its founding 75 years ago, far more aid than we've provided to any other country. And so Jose Andres said, Israel is better than the way this war is being waged. You cannot save the hostages by bombing every building in Gaza. You cannot win this war by starving an entire population. The words of Chef Andres. Madam President, I recognize that the Prime Minister makes his own decisions, and it is for the Israeli people to hold him accountable. But he is not, and in my view, has never been, a credible partner for the United States. Combating ruthless terrorists like Hamas is a challenge we face, Israel faces, the world faces. But this war is not making any of us safer from terrorism. It is creating the next generation of terrorists. With an invasion of Rafah looming, the Biden administration has warned Mr. Netanyahu that unless there is a credible plan to relocate the Palestinians who are trapped there, such an invasion would cause unacceptable civilian losses. That, however, does not appear to have dissuaded Prime Minister Netanyahu. World opinion has shifted sharply against Israel and the United States. The administration, while calling for a ceasefire and more humanitarian aid, is simultaneously sending more bombs and ammunition to Israel. It's an inconsistency that is not sustainable. It's long past time for the U.S. to adopt a consistent policy, to stop financing a war strategy that was deeply flawed from the very beginning, a strategy of unending death and destruction without any plan for what comes next. Instead of prolonging this catastrophe, let's use our influence and our resources to advance a consistent policy for the Middle East, a policy that has to be grounded in the recognition that the people of Israel will never be secure without upholding the inherent rights and dignity of the Palestinian people as well. Madam President, after 6 months of war, the situation, regrettably, in Gaza is worse than ever. Hamas is not defeated, nor do the experts that I have spoken to believe it can be. Gaza is all but destroyed. 2 million Palestinians lack the basic necessities of life and have nothing to return to. We need to change course. The hostages need to come home. The killing needs to stop. The war must end. Madam President, I yield back.
Senator from Hawaii.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the following legislative fellows in my office be granted floor privileges for the remainder of the Congress: Nancy Connolly, Nico Fairbairn, Will Poff-Webster, and Ashley Nagel.
Without objection.
Madam President, it has been more than 5 months since the President submitted a domestic supplemental appropriations request to Congress. And among other things, it called for funding recovery efforts in communities across the country struck by disasters, including Lahaina, Maui. Every one of these affected communities in Florida, in California, in Vermont, in Mississippi, in Alabama, in Arkansas, in Alaska, in South Dakota, in Georgia, Illinois, Indiana, and Tennessee need help. Each one of them is in the middle of a long and difficult process of rebuilding and getting back on its feet. Recovering from a disaster, whether natural or man-made, it is hard, it is time-intensive, and it's incredibly expensive. Surveying the damage in the immediate hours and days following the event, undertaking the complex and often dangerous process of debris removal, rebuilding homes and roads and schools and other essential infrastructure that were destroyed. Providing financial assistance to people, families, and small business owners who lost their jobs and livelihoods overnight. It takes months and years and tremendous effort from thousands of people to return these communities to anything close to normal. Today, another community is unfortunately confronting the colossal task of rebuilding, this time in Baltimore, in the wake of the tragic collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Our hearts go out to the families of the 6 men who were lost that day. They were fathers, they were husbands, they were brothers, immigrants who worked day and night to provide for their families, and their losses break our collective hearts. As Baltimore recovers, we stand ready to support all of the communities and businesses that relied on that bridge and the Port of Baltimore every day to get around and move goods through. And as the chair of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Transportation, I'm committed to doing everything I can to help pass the necessary funding to rebuild. And as we do that, we also have a responsibility to support every other community that has been devastated by a disaster, because we are all in this together. No state or county, big or small, red or blue, wealthy or not, can shoulder the burden alone. When a disaster is so big, so catastrophic for any one state or locality to handle, it falls on the federal government to step up and help. It is central to the promise of the federal government. We can argue about the size and the scope of the federal government all we like, which programs to fund, what levels to fund them at, but even the most libertarian among us can agree that helping our fellow Americans when they are in a crisis, when they've lost everything, when they are desperate for support, helping them is patriotic and essential to our roles in the Congress. It's why funding disaster recovery has historically been bipartisan, because people on both sides of the aisle have recognized rightly that disasters do not discriminate between red and blue and purple areas. Accidents don't pick and choose their victims. Every community that has had the misfortune of being struck by a disaster needs and deserves help. Maui is just one example of what these communities are facing. 8 months on from the devastating fires, the needs remain enormous. Thousands of people are still living out of hotels and vacation rentals, unable to rebuild their lives. Roads and water systems have yet to be repaired. Small businesses and their employees continue to struggle without tourism. For Lahaina to recover, thousands of homes will need to be rebuilt. Critical infrastructure will need to be restored. Businesses will need to get up and running again. And so Congress needs to step up and help. That includes providing funding for the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery, or CDBG-DR program, as the supplemental request calls for. CDBG-DR funding has long been a lifeline for families and small businesses recovering after disasters. Maui and many other communities nationwide are waiting on this aid. It has been nearly 6 months since the President called on Congress to help communities recover from their disasters. We've waited a long time, and we can't wait much longer. The disasters keep piling up, and with them, the urgent needs of the survivors. People need help. And so as we need to pass this supplemental and make sure all the survivors are getting the relief that they need, this is not each against all. We are truly all in this together. Every community that has been hurt by a natural disaster deserves help, and Congress must provide it. I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
President.
Senator from West Virginia.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to
Senator, we are in a quorum call.
I ask that we vitiate the quorum call, please.
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam President, I rise today because we really are at a very historic time for this chamber. Soon, the House of Representatives is expected to send over articles of impeachment against a cabinet officer for only the second time in our nation's history. This is not routine business. Instead, this is a very serious moment. On February 13th, the House agreed to articles of impeachment against Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas for, quote, willful and systemic refusal to comply with the law, end of quote, and, quote, breach of public trust, end of quote. This chamber will soon have a constitutional duty to uphold, and I firmly believe that the Senate, the U.S. Senate, must conduct a full impeachment inquiry trial for Secretary Mayorkas. Our Constitution gives the Senate the responsibility and the duty to try all impeachments, and it requires a vote of 2/3 of the Senate present before the federal officer is convicted. That's a pretty high standard for a constitutional process. For every impeachment in our history, the Senate has held some form of a trial, unless the federal officer has resigned prior to the trial. This time, it should be no different. Under President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas, there have been more than 9.2 million illegal crossings along our country's southern borders. Or, to put it another way, the average monthly encounters have increased 400% almost under the Biden-Mayorkas DHS. The record illegal crossings in this is past February of 189,922 marked the 7th consecutive month of the highest number of encounters that these months have ever seen. And on top of this, there have been 36 straight months with higher encounters at the southern border than any other month under the Trump administration. I mean, these numbers are just shocking. It's still, as I sit, and I've spoken on this before, it's just amazing to me that the President and Secretary Mayorkas haven't tried to change this at all. Unfortunately, these statistics have become a regular occurrence under the leadership of Secretary Mayorkas, and he bears the responsibility for the worst border crisis of our nation's history. Let me be clear, as I said earlier, this crisis did not happen by accident. We have seen the Biden-Mayorkas DHS fail to uphold the law and secure our borders starting on day one of this administration. This broad and willful effort by the Biden administration to open our borders began by ending successful Trump-era policies that brought all those numbers down, like contracts to build the border wall. The Remain in Mexico policy, also known as Migrant Protection Protocols, or MPP, and Safe Third Country Agreements. Again, the numbers don't lie, and they certainly do not provide the administration with any cover. Unlike the cover the administration gives daily by turning their back to the cartels who are making billions of dollars with human smuggling, drug trafficking operations as long as this crisis continues. Furthermore, we've seen Secretary Mayorkas abuse the parole process, expanding the program more than any other prior administration, which has led to more than 3 million immigrants coming into our country who would otherwise have been inadmissible. Parole is supposed to be granted on a one-by-one, case-by-case basis. But under Secretary Mayorkas' leadership, DHS has created categorical parole programs to give entry to migrants from many South American and Caribbean countries with minimal vetting. As the crisis has developed throughout President Biden's 3 years in office, nearly half of the migrants encountered in our southern border are coming from countries outside of Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. The immigration crisis on our southern border is now more multifaceted than ever. And why is that? Because it's been allowed to keep fomenting. And the open border policies for the Biden-Mayorkas DHS has allowed all of this to happen. We truly have no idea who is entering our country illegally. We have apprehended 336 individuals on the terror watch list that have illegally crossed our southern border during this administration. But these are just the individuals that we know of. To put this into perspective, only 14 terror suspects were apprehended between the ports of entry during the Trump administration. 14 over 4 years, 336 in this administration. Not knowing who's in our country is a national security crisis. And at a time of heightened national security, this is a chance we should not be willing to take. We've also seen the Biden-Mayorkas DHS abuse the asylum process, expanding eligibility to admit a record number of asylum seekers, which has led to creating decades-long delays and backlogs in our immigration courts. This ensures that anyone who enters our country and passes the very low screening standard will be here for years without any fear of deportation. This policy allowed the alleged killer of Laken Riley, a nursing student in Georgia who was brutally and senselessly murdered, to enter. He entered and has remained in this country. Even though he was apprehended by our law enforcement on at least one occasion, he still was here. This will ever serve as a reminder that Secretary Mayorkas' catch and release policies have allowed the catastrophe at our southern border to impact every single community. When our already overwhelmed Border Patrol agents are faced with thousands of encounters per day of migrants claiming asylum, we know that some border crossings are able to slip through. These are the people who don't want to be caught, and they are the individuals we need to worry about the most. But don't just take my word for it. In a recent interview, Border Patrol Chief Jason Owens referred to the situation at the southern border as a national security threat, and that the 140,000 known gotaways are what's keeping, he says, keeping me up at night. This is something that all of us should be concerned about, and the ripple effect that this causes in communities far away from our southern border. Additionally, The drugs flowing across our border are responsible for fueling the addiction epidemic that has devastated communities across this country, and particularly in my home state of West Virginia. In West Virginia alone, it is estimated that during the year 2023, 1,327 residents died at the hands of illegal drugs. That's the highest per capita of any other state. At the national level, the numbers are just startling. According to U.S. Borders and Customs and Borders Protection agents, they seized an all-time high of 20,293 pounds of fentanyl coming across the southern border in fiscal year 23. That amount of fentanyl is enough to kill nearly 6 million people. However, what is even more troubling is that CBP reported that federal officials are estimating that they were only able to seize between 5 and 10% of all the fentanyl that has been smuggled through the southern border. With a Border Patrol stat that has been stretched unfathomably thin, with very little support from this administration, there's no telling the amount of drugs that are getting through undetected. So, regarding the matter that will soon be before the Senate, the impeachment articles against Secretary Mayorkas make serious allegations and detail the crisis we have all seen unfolding for more than 3 years. It is unconscionable for Senator Schumer to dismiss these charges without allowing the Senate to hear the evidence. Doing so would deny this body from upholding our constitutional duty to hear a case and decide whether or not Secretary Mayorkas should be convicted or acquitted. The decision to take up these articles of impeachment lies with the Senator Schumer and the Senate Democrats. They must do the right thing and conduct a full trial. With that, I yield the floor.
Senator from Kansas.
Madam President, thank you. I appreciate what I heard from the Senator from West Virginia, Senator Capito, and I'm pleased to follow her and precede a number of my colleagues as we address the issue of the crisis at our southern border. I want to highlight something I heard her say and reiterate myself. This is a national security threat. There's many reasons to care about what's going on at our borders. And certainly you can take a look at the issue of sovereignty and the nature of our country. We need to enforce our laws, fentanyl and drugs, human trafficking. But sometimes overlooked is the reality of what a security threat, a border like we have between the United States and Mexico, but really all of our borders, they create a threat to the safety and well-being of the American people, the citizens of our country. And yes, we have to deal with the growing drug and crime emergency. It's exacerbated. I've been talking to a number of law enforcement officers in Kansas, sheriff's departments and police officers, and there's no question but what they see in Kansas. The challenges are exacerbated by the lack of security, the lack of law enforcement at our borders, and see the consequences of that activity in human trafficking and drugs. It's important for us to talk about all of the things, focus on all of the things related to our national security. In my view, it's the primary responsibility of the federal government to make certain that Americans are safe. And I was on the Senate floor several weeks ago highlighting something I think is hugely important to our national security, the passage of the emergency supplemental. The consequences for the United States has consequences. The lack of passing that legislation has a consequence to the people of Ukraine and the people of Israel and the Middle East, about the safety and security of other countries in the South Pacific. but I highlighted then and would highlight now the passage of that emergency supplemental has a consequence, a negative consequence if it's not passed, on the safety and security of the American people. And so when I was here to highlight the importance of that legislation and the need to proceed, I also highlighted the consequences of ignoring our border. And I want to say once again, our border is a national security issue. So while we focus on the things that we normally think about national security, sometimes we forget this dangerous circumstance that has been created. I've been to the border a number of times, numerous times. On my last visit, I watched as Border Patrol agents apprehended Chinese nationals attempting to come into our country illegally. That, in and of itself, ought to cause us to have great concern. Under Secretary Mayorkas's watch, the U.S. Border Patrol has apprehended 336 individuals on the terror watch list. Remember the terror watch list and the people who came here on 9/11 and the consequences of us failing to exclude them. But 336 have been apprehended from that terrorist watch list, and that doesn't include the ones who we have not caught. It suggests to me, and I hope to us, that there is a real serious issue about our national security as a result of our country's failures, this administration's failures on the border. In FY23, a year ago fiscal year, in that year alone, men and women of the United States Customs and Border Protection had approximately 2.5 million encounters along that southern border. These historic levels of crossings at the southern border have put an astronomical, just a tremendous strain on our immigration system and seriously compromised, as I say, compromised our national security. Not every immigrant is a criminal, but the sheer number of migrants at the border enables those with evil and malicious intentions to enter our country undetected and to harm Americans. This historic failure is not an accident. Migrants making their way to the United States, often through the assistance of organized criminal organizations, know our laws and the current lack of enforcement of those laws. This administration has created these conditions and has done little, if not really nothing, to dissuade migrants from making that dangerous journey to our borders. Migrants know that the administration has resisted detaining those who cross the border illegally. They know that this administration has resisted hardening border infrastructure, and they know that the administration's abuse of the parole system will increase the chances of remaining in the United States if they can get across the border. All of those factors lead us to where we are today. Last fall, I questioned the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas. We had a joint appropriations committee. The hearing was on our national security, and the topic was the supplemental I referenced in my remarks several weeks ago on the Senate floor and just a moment ago. And when I asked Secretary Mayorkas if he was willing to work on areas of immigration reform where there is bipartisan consensus, certain issues, I believe, in regard to border security would receive 60 votes on the Senate floor and be signed into law. The Secretary told me that he wanted comprehensive reform. I've been in this body, the Senate, I've been in the House before then. We've talked about immigration changes. We've talked about border security. Those two things go hand in hand, in my view. And we know where this insistence that we have comprehensive immigration reform ends. No evidence in my time in the Senate, no evidence in my time in the House that if we have to do everything, the evidence is that we do nothing. And that's what I told the Secretary. I would tell him that again. If you're unwilling to work with us to find the things that we can agree on, then nothing is going to happen to protect our borders, and our immigration system remains so flawed. There is value, of course, in comprehensive reform, things that deal with all issues, top to bottom, to ensure the needs of safety for American people and the importance of that to our economy. But again, my experience in my time in Congress is that if we keep waiting for comprehensive reform, the result is nothing. We do nothing. Secretary Mayorkas has an obligation to use the tools Congress has already provided to enforce legislation that is already passed. Waiting for comprehensive reform is an excuse from the Secretary and for the President Biden, to do nothing. Mayorkas's inaction on the border and his leniency toward enforcing the law has resulted in what we see, the crisis we face today. We keep waiting to reach the tipping point in that crisis, but that, I think, has long passed. Migrants are living on the streets in New York. We've lost thousands of Americans to fentanyl poisoning, and our borders have been exploited by our enemies. My point is that America is in jeopardy in many ways. We face tremendous challenges around the globe, and our adversaries and enemies are aligned to do us harm. And one of the places that we cannot look the other way is our borders and our border security. It's too great of a risk and too much of a opportunity for death and destruction to come to the United States of America. The Biden administration has made it clear over the last 3 years, securing our border is not a priority. It's not a priority of theirs. And now it's up to the Senate to hold the administration accountable for those failures, the failures at our southern border, again, that affect our national security, the #1 priority of the federal government. Every state is a border state, and the American people deserve a secure border. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Tennessee.
In our nation's 248-year history, the House of Representatives has impeached officials in 21 cases. Reflecting the grave, highly rare exercise of this constitutional power, the Senate has tried each such case, except where the person resigned office before the Senate trial, rendering such trial moot. This includes 2 partisan Democrat impeaches of the former president, one in which Republicans controlled the Senate, one in which it was equally divided. Shattering norms, however, is becoming a defining theme for Democrats this year. Why are my Democrat colleagues so eager to shirk their constitutional duty and ignore an impeachment? Because they want to ignore the damning evidence of Secretary Mayorkas's willful violations of immigration law. I can think of no better example than the Secretary's decision to willfully and knowingly exceed his parole authority set forth in the Immigration and Nationality Act. That law permits the Secretary to grant parole, but only on a case-by-case basis, temporarily, and for urgent humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit. For example, when a person is in need of urgent medical care, or if a person needs to attend a family member's funeral. He's even created a new taxpayer-funded parole program to allow aliens from numerous countries to be flown directly into the United States. He's abused his case-by-case parole authority beyond any degree imaginable. He's now flying 30,000 illegal aliens per month directly into the United States for resettlement. This is a blatant violation of the law, and it's abuse of the parole law in particular. 2 weeks ago, every single Senate Democrat voted against my appropriations amendment to defund this very parole flight program. That vote was impossible to explain to ordinary Americans. They see the absurdity of flying in tens of thousands of illegal aliens right in the midst of an illegal immigration crisis. So instead, partisan so-called fact-checkers have recently been quibbling over which flights or which airports are being used. This is clearly an attempt to distract from the basic problem with this taxpayer-funded program, which is that it's illegal and it's absurd. I understand why Democrats want to cover it up, though. It's the same reason they don't want to consider these impeachment articles. Similarly, the Secretary terminated contracts for border wall construction and refused to expand funds that Congress appropriated for this specific purpose. Secretary Mayorkas's impoundment of funds is a clear attempt to usurp the will of Congress by refusing to fulfill their mandate, our mandate, to build the border wall. The Secretary has also replaced the pension mandates that are enacted in law with unlawful mass catch-and-release policies that encourage illegal immigration. The law requires that illegal aliens are detained until they're deported, unless they are clearly and beyond a doubt entitled to be allowed into the United States. Instead of complying with this requirement, the Secretary has released millions of illegal aliens into American communities. We've seen the devastating effects of the Biden administration's illegal border policies. We've heard from Americans whose lives and property are being destroyed by droves of illegal aliens who are coming into the United States every single day. We've heard from Border Patrol agents who want nothing more than to do their jobs and secure the border, but whose hands have been tied by the Mayorkas-led Department of Homeland Security. The American people have seen the chaotic images of the southern border under this administration. They've witnessed the ravaging effects of illegal immigration in their own communities. This includes drug overdoses, violent crime, local disorder, and the national security threat of unknown bad actors from all over the world coming across our open borders. 249 people on the terror watch list have been encountered at the southern border just last year alone. Since October, a record number of Chinese nationals, 22,000 in fact, have been encountered by our Border Patrol. In all, over 10 million illegal aliens across the border under this Secretary's watch. The collapse of our southern border and the devastating consequences and future risks it has created for our nation is the greatest national security risk we face as a nation. The House of Representatives took the extraordinary step of impeaching a government official for his role in this. And yet Senate Democrats want to completely ignore all of this. They don't want you to hear about it. They want to sweep it under the rug in an election year. The Secretary's alleged violations of law warrant a trial before the Senate. It warrants basic diligence in examining the evidence. And every senator should go on record regarding the charges. I've co-sponsored resolutions by several colleagues establishing impeachment procedures that are in line with past Senate impeachment trials. We're open to debate on the details of the process, but there must be a process. This is an important point. The current debate is not even whether or not Secretary Mayorkas is guilty as charged, but whether we should even examine the question, or whether instead, as the Senate Majority Leader reportedly plans to do, we should just hide the evidence from the American people and avoid discussing this administration's failures at all costs. Why? Because this is an election year. If the Majority Leader wishes to honor and preserve the world's greatest deliberative body, I urge him not to take this unprecedented step of blocking consideration of the impeachment articles against Secretary Mayorkas. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Nebraska.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the following interns for my office be granted floor privileges until April 11, 2024. Reese Clark, Nathan Muhlenberg, Jack Smith.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. The fundamental purpose of our federal government is to protect Americans, to keep Americans safe. What we have seen happen in our southern border has put Americans at risk. It's a national security crisis, a drug trafficking crisis, child trafficking, sex trafficking. It's putting Americans at risk. And the people responsible for this open border policy are Joe Biden and the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas. Since the Biden administration has been in power, we have seen a flood of drugs coming across our border. The cartels are making billions. Fentanyl and other illegal drugs are the leading killer of young Americans in this country. If you are the age between 18 and 45, the most likely cause of your death is drug overdose, and the majority of that is fentanyl. 70,000 young people a year dying because of fentanyl. When I was governor, we saw the amount of drugs coming into my state under Joe Biden go up dramatically. We saw twice as much of methamphetamine, 3 times as much fentanyl, 10 times as much cocaine. We've seen the number of people on the terrorist watch list skyrocket as well. Under the Trump administration, a total of 11 people on the FBI terrorist watch list were caught trying to cross the border during 4 years of President Trump. In the last fiscal year, 169 people on the FBI terrorist watch list were trying to cross the border illegally. In all, since the Biden administration has been in place, 9.2 million people have either tried to get into this country illegally or have succeeded in getting into this country illegally. And Secretary Mayorkas has willfully refused to support our immigration laws at the direction of this administration. He is culpable in what is going on at our southern border. If you ask Americans, who do you think is responsible? 57% say there has been a willful unenforcement of our laws. Our laws are not being enforced. That includes 61% of independents and a third of Democrats. And if you wonder who is responsible for this, you need to look no further than a memorandum, a guideline that was issued in 2021 from Secretary Mayorkas. According to news accounts, Secretary Mayorkas issued a memorandum to Immigration and Customs Enforcement officials saying, and I quote, "The fact an individual is a removable non-citizen, therefore should not alone be the basis of an enforcement action against them." Think about that. What he is saying is that just because somebody broke the law doesn't mean you have to enforce the law against them. In fact, that you shouldn't enforce the law against them. That's not what the law is about. This is absolutely stunning. When you're in the private sector and somebody is not doing their job, you hold them accountable. We need to hold accountable the people that have opened our southern border. 57% believe that there has been a willful disregard. And not only do those people in our country believe that, but the U.S. House of Representatives has passed an impeachment resolution condemning Secretary Mayorkas for, and I'm going to quote here again, willful and systematic refusal to comply with current U.S. immigration laws, end quote, and for, quote, breach of public trust, end quote. Impeachment is serious, and these allegations are serious. We in the U.S. Senate need to treat them with that level of seriousness. We have seen an open border policy from this administration. Secretary Mayorkas is responsible for carrying out the policy. It is now our duty as a U.S. Senate to have the trial to determine guilt or innocence. This is a constitutional responsibility. However, it appears that our leader and the Democrats are determined to table this, to set it aside in a manner that is unprecedented. It has never happened that the U.S. Senate has refused to take up the charges. Folks, we don't need to be breaking more norms in the U.S. Senate. We are abdicating our constitutional responsibility if we do not hold this trial. The people responsible need to be held accountable. We need to hear the evidence. So why don't the Democrats want to hold this trial? Well, perhaps because they are afraid of the American public hearing again how bad the situation at the southern border is. The 9.2 million people coming in here. Or perhaps they don't want to know how this administration and Secretary Mayorkas is abusing the parole function Parole is a function that allows the executive branch to bring in foreigners. It's supposed to be done, according to the Immigration and Naturalization Act, on a case-by-case basis. Only in instances of extreme humanitarian need or in the best interest of the country. Under the Obama and Trump administration, it happened about 5,600 times a year. 5,600 times a year. Last year alone, this Biden administration paroled into the country 1.2 million people. They're doing whole classes of people. It is a clear abuse of power. This administration is also abusing the asylum system. And Secretary Mayorkas has overseen the Department of Homeland Security with both this new policy in parole and what's going on in asylum. And think about this. Say you're somebody who comes across that border and you were granted parole to get into this country, like Jose Ibarra, the Venezuelan accused of killing Laken Riley. And you get into this country, what's the first thing you're doing? You're contacting folks back home to tell them what happened to you. This creates more incentive for people to come here illegally. It's part of why we have this problem. We need to explore topics like this. Or perhaps the Democrats know how bad this is and don't want to defend the catastrophe that's going on at the southern border. They don't want to have to defend this administration's policy, what Secretary Mayorkas has been doing with regard to parole. Maybe they think it's bad too and don't want to have to defend it. But whatever the reason, if our leader does not have a trial, it will be the first time this has happened. It'll be unprecedented. And we will be breaking again another norm for the U.S. Senate. Impeachment is serious. These charges are serious. The American people deserve an answer. We need to have a trial. I call on my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to insist upon a trial, uphold our constitutional authority. Let's have a trial so that we can hear and determine the guilt and innocence. That's what the American people deserve. Madam President, I yield back.
Madam President,
The senator from Oklahoma.
next week we're scheduled to begin a trial. Secretary of Homeland Security. It doesn't begin a conversation about Homeland Security in our country. That conversation started years ago now. The American people are incredibly frustrated with what they're seeing on the southern border, and they keep saying it over and over again. Remarkably so in a nation where inflation continues to be stubbornly high, where it's harder and harder to be able to afford a carton of eggs and gasoline and all the basics of life. In all the areas that you would think the economy would be the #1 issue in the nation, actually national security and border security ends up being #1, regardless of what state you live in. This is no longer a border state issue. Americans feel this is a problem. Well, they should. In the past 3 years, more people have illegally crossed our southern border than the previous 12 years combined. And it's not close, the number. We're approaching 8 million people that have illegally crossed our southern border just in the last 3 years. Cities feel it, Americans feel it, school districts feel it, communities feel it, homeless shelters feel it. It continues to spiral into our country. This is not some accident of migration, as the administration tries to say over and over again, that there's global migration that's happening everywhere. This was a series of executive orders that were done in 2021 that were intentionally designed to change what's happening at our southern border, and they certainly have. Decisions were made in 2021 by the Biden administration to be able to shift multiple things, starting with loosening enforcement. Day one of the Biden administration, stop any construction of the wall and announce it publicly, we're no longer going to do wall construction, not even repair. Step number two, dramatically loosen the actual enforcement within the country so that fewer people would actually be deported when they came. So if you cross the border illegally, it's much greater likelihood that once you get across, you will not be deported. Third thing, they changed the Remain in Mexico policy. That simple policy to say that, yes, you can request asylum, but you can't just be released in the country, they shifted immediately and shifted it from remain at the border or in Mexico. Rather than being in detention, you could be released anywhere in the country on your own recognizance and to be able to go anywhere you want. That dramatically increased the number of people that were crossing. They also shifted where the State Department is no longer negotiating deals with Central America, in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador to be able to stop migrants from moving through that direction. They've withdrawn those agreements from Central America, and the State Department stopped putting pressure on recalcitrant countries that wouldn't take their people back. These were not accidental things. These were intentional actions. But what I don't think the administration intended was how this has spiraled out of control. They sowed to the wind, and the nation's reaping the whirlwind out of it. Almost 8 million people now that have illegally crossed our border. And now it's no longer people from the Western Hemisphere. Literally, it's people from all over the world. Pick up any tracking at any point to be able to track what's happening at the border, and you'll find thousands of people that are crossing from China, from Russia, from Pakistan, from West Africa, from all over Asia. When I talk to people at the border, and I do talk often to them, one of the first things I ask is, what are the trends? What are you seeing? And for the past year and a half, they continue to tell me a greater and greater number of non-Spanish speakers that are crossing that border that are males in their 20s from all over the world that are coming. Just in the past year, we picked up individuals that are al-Shabaab terrorist connections, picked up folks with Hezbollah terrorist connections, picked up folks with all kinds of different connections to all kinds of different terrorist organizations, and we have been able to pick up some, but some have gotten through or been released. This is an issue I continue to be able to bring up, that this administration is not managing. In the past year, there were over 70,000 individuals that were identified as what was defined as a special interest alien. These individuals crossed our border, the administration designated them as a special interest alien, and then released them on their own recognizance into the country. Let me clarify what that term is. A special interest alien, this is their definition, a non-U.S. person who is based on the analysis of travel patterns potentially poses a national security threat to the United States or its interests. 70,000 of those in the past year have crossed the border and have been released into the United States. This is no longer a simple migration issue. This is a national security issue. And it's one this administration is not only invited, but they've now chosen to not even take seriously. This body knows full well. I believe there are some things that can only be done by acts of this body. Changing the definition of asylum, increasing the number of detention beds. There's multiple issues that we need to do and we should take responsibility for. But this body should not sit and say nothing can be done when the White House has authorities they're not using. We should do our job. The White House should do their job. And currently, that's not happening. And the threat continues to increase. So next week, we start an impeachment trial, which has never happened in the history of the Department of Homeland Security to be able to have an impeachment of the Secretary. That starts. But can I say to you, even if the Secretary is removed, the White House has still created this policy. The Obama administration had multiple leaders in that role, but they had one policy. The Trump administration had multiple leaders in that role. They had one policy. This White House has a policy of maintaining an open border. And until this White House changes that policy and actually uses the authority that they already have, none of this is going to change. So my challenge is to us. We should do our job and work on the issues we should do. But this White House needs to step up, because right now, they're just hoping that none of those 70,000 people they defined as a national security risk actually does an act of terrorism or crime in the country. I don't want to just hope that someone that we've defined as a national security risk doesn't actually carry it out. I think we need to actually enforce the law. I think we need to discourage illegal immigration. And I think we need to actually have a secure border. And I don't believe I'm alone in that, in this body or in our great country. That I yield the floor.
The senator from Alabama.
Madam President, Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas and globalist Democrats have been derelict in their duty to secure the border under President Joe Biden. I repeat, derelict in their duty. Our border is the least secure it has been in the history of our country. In fact, it's almost non-existent. At least 9 million illegal immigrants have entered our country since the beginning of this administration. Our Border Patrol agents are overwhelmed and receive such little support from the Biden administration to enforce our laws that they have been forced to release millions of illegal immigrants into the U.S. And those who are released on parole are given work permits. Tell me this, how does handing out work permits discourage illegal immigration? It doesn't. How do these actions secure the border? It doesn't. We might as well start mailing out every criminal, drug trafficker, and terrorist an open invitation to invade our country. I have spoken numerous times on the floor to highlight stories of Americans dying at the hands of illegal aliens. 12-year-old Travis Wolf of Missouri, 22-year-old Laken Riley of Georgia, Washington State Trooper Chris Gadd. Tragic deaths are a direct result of Secretary Mayorkas' inaction. How many more Americans have to die before the globalist Democratic Party takes meaningful action to secure the border? This madness must end. Americans deserve to be safe from the drug traffickers, terrorists, and murderers who are flooding into our country. The number of people crossing into the U.S. are on the terrorist watch list. It's unprecedented. Fentanyl flows freely across our borders and is killing more and more Americans every day.